Hello, my name is Martin Bright, and I am your chair today of the Thought Leaders for webinar on risks faced by whistleblowers and how to counter them. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship and have worked for many years as a journalist, often writing about whistleblowers, most prominently in the case of Catherine Gunn, an intelligence service whistleblower who was the subject of a film called Official Secrets in 2019. As a direct result of working on that film, I was introduced to Jonathan Taylor, the whistleblower whose story we're going to be talking about today. And I found Jonathan's story intriguing and extraordinary from the moment I met him. We'll, in a moment, begin by interviewing Jonathan about his story. And I think it's probably best just to go through the format. We will be conducting that interview. I'll be conducting that interview for about 20 minutes. And then I will be introducing the other participants in today's webinar. Toby Cadman, the head of Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers, who's been representing Jonathan in his extradition case. Jonathan is talking to us today from Croatia, where he is fighting extradition to Monaco. This will all become clear in the process of today's webinar. And I will also be joined by Anna Myers, the Executive Director of Whistleblowing International Network, who's been at the center of organizing the support group for Jonathan, which has been, we all hope, very helpful in supporting him and fighting his corner. So first of all, welcome Jonathan from Zagreb. Just as I was beginning to investigate Jonathan's story, in July of 2020, Jonathan chose to go on holiday to Dubrovnik in Croatia, only to find himself arrested at the airport and facing extradition to Monaco. Monaco being the country where SBM Offshore, the company he was working for, is or was based. Now, Jonathan, I thought I'd just ask you first of all to outline what it was in January 2012, all that time ago, that led you to decide that things were so bad at SBM Offshore that you needed to blow the whistle?
It was a really easy choice. It was either to stay and be involved in a cover-up. A committee was formed to investigate the matter, and central to its raison d'etre was to cover up the magnitude of the bribes of SBM Offshore, paid to win contracts, or to leave. And it was obviously appropriate to leave, which is what I obviously did without a job to go to.
What was the nature of these bribe payments, and how did you initially find out about them as a company?
So the nature was predominantly the use of agents being paid upwards of 250 million for the 5 years leading up to 2012 alone, but the bribes went all the way back to the 1990s. So I, being with SBM for over 8.5 years, suddenly those that were on the outside and didn't know about this massive bribery schemes to win business became involved specifically in legal when a compliance lawyer telephoned the General Counsel to report a likely compliance breach. A lawyer who knew the General Counsel from a previous dealing about text of a contract and the appropriate wording for compliance matters in that. And then from that moment on, it became clear what the mantra or the manner in which the company did business. And the floodgates
And
opened.
this,
I found in a short period of time that the magnitude of it all.
and this was in Equatorial Guinea initially, is that correct?
Correct. So if the company had its way, it would have stayed in Equatorial Guinea, which was relatively small in terms of the magnitude of the bribes of the company. But yes, if it had had its way, it would have stayed in Africa, specifically EG, and gone nowhere else. It being the admissions to the requisite authorities.
And so perhaps it would be useful just to explain, because it's relatively simple, how this system worked, because the system that operated in Equatorial Guinea, you then discovered was in fact happening around the world. It was also happening in Angola. It was also happening in Iraq. It was also happening in Brazil. So could you just explain exactly how it worked that these agents paid bribes to the local officials and how that proceeded?
So without going on a country by country basis, predominantly the main means used was indeed agents. So agents were paid sums of money, and they kept back normally up to 33% of that, and then paid on monies invariably through Swiss bank accounts to people of influence, invariably in national oil and gas companies, who could ensure that SBM, who's a major player in the oil services industry, won contracts, often $2-3 billion plus contracts. Otherwise, a former head of sales and marketing was also used as an agent, and he was also paying bribes on a not particularly country-specific basis, but others were very country-specific, like the example of Brazil. Subsequently, it became clearer to me also certain individuals, kleptocrats within oil and gas companies, were being paid monies through companies that were set up purely to pay bribes. But I wasn't aware of those until sometime later. What I was aware of was these basic agency agreements entered into for payments in the likes of Equatorial Guinea and Brazil and Angola predominantly, but not exclusively. Finally, there's also a company called Unoil based in Monaco, and its very being was the facilitation of the payment of bribes. They have been a long time exposed, but that was a company that SBM used to pay bribes in, for example, Iraq and Italy and Kazakhstan.
Just briefly, before we go on to talk about what you did next, what was the business exactly of SBM Offshore? I mean, we hear that it's an oil company, but it's not really, is it? I mean, what was its business?
The main business was the fabrication of what are called floating production and storage offloading units. So think of a big oil tanker converted to stay above an offshore oil field for 20 plus years, permanently moored. And oil would come from under the sea bed to vessel via certain risers, they're called, basically big hose pipes, where the oil and gas would be processed and stored in the hull, and then tankers would come back and forth and remove the oil and take it to refineries. So, but these FPSOs, can lease for up to $500,000 per day. So it's the main go-to for international oil and gas companies and state oil and gas companies to use to exploit reserves found offshore in deep waters.
So highly lucrative, and certain individuals within the company felt it was definitely worthwhile paying bribes in order to get contracts to set these FPSOs up offshore. You decided, once you discovered what was going on, that this was not right. So what did you do to blow the whistle initially? So
I initially reported the company anonymously through a US attorney to the US Securities and Exchange Commission. So SBM had traded American depository receipts on the New York Stock Exchange. There was a possibility that the SEC would have jurisdiction. But I outlined to the SEC through my attorney, the major bribes, again, Equatorial Guinea, Angola, and Brazil. Ultimately, it decided that it didn't have jurisdiction, and so nothing happened. So people think of the SEC fouling up over the Madoff affair, but the value of Petrobras, for example, used to be the biggest by market capitalization company in the Southern Hemisphere, and people lost literally hundreds of billions of dollars as a result of this scandal. And the SEC were notified of it early days back in 2012 as a result of being one of the recipients of SBM bribes. Still chose to do nothing, even though, of course, their shares are traded, half of their shares are traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
So nothing happens, and so you decide ultimately to act. So around October 2013, you decide to act. You decide to act in a, some would say, peculiar way. What did you decide to do?
Well, first and foremost, the reason I went to the SEC at all was I wanted to make my mark within less than 2 weeks of finding out about the scandal, so I could prove and demonstrate, if need be, that I'd gone to the authorities. Because the last thing I wanted to do was be embroiled in the scandal and some sort of associate in assisting it by not going to the authorities. I didn't want to be putting my head in the sand. That was the most important reason I went to the SEC. Ultimately, I was requested to leave the company. It was becoming obvious that bin bags were being filled with information and thrown out, and the cover-up was becoming more and more obvious. I was upset with the SEC, the fact it decided not to act. I was now reading press releases denying basically anything and everything. It was a beautiful, super squeaky clean company. And I decided to act by putting a large post on its SBM Offshore's Wikipedia page, which was immediately taken down by the Wikipedia police. And I thought that was the end of the matter. It was later found under the history tab, which I didn't know existed, by a journalist in February 2014, and that's when the exposure really began. But yes, I tried the authorities and didn't get anywhere, so that's the next best thing I could think of.
Well, yes, exactly. Sometimes whistleblowers need to find whatever means possible to get the information out. So the information then is out. And again, if you could possibly just summarize the consequences of the information getting out. I mean, they had to act at that point. SBM Offshore had to act. And as a result, there were investigations across several jurisdictions. Could you just briefly summarize those for us?
So they had to admit to obviously these payments being made to other countries outside Africa, to quote various press releases, i.e. Brazil, which was but meat and potatoes. I mean, well over 60, 70% of the bribes were paid to Petrobras. I soon became very popular with public prosecutors in the Netherlands, in Brazil, in the UK, in Switzerland, to name but 4. I think altogether I reported to 7, Canada also. And yes, I helped each one of those prosecutors, and did I say the US, individually through a mini tour of the world, providing them with all the evidence they could possibly have needed, which ultimately led to almost $1 billion of bribes in reaching settlements with SBM, and a very small handful of prosecutions of individuals.
And already, I mean, from the outset, let's say SBM Offshore did not welcome your revelations didn't welcome them at all. Indeed, the attacks on you and the attempts to undermine you and to attack your credibility, they began pretty quickly. And again, I think it would be very helpful for you to just go through the campaign against you by SBM Offshore and what they did.
So after the Wikipedia release was publicised, they put up various press releases and announcements on their website, calling me malicious and a vulgar blackmailer. They ultimately reported me to the police in Monaco in September 2014 for attempted extortion, something I was not informed about for 3 years. We can go back to that if you want. They then also sued me for defamation in June 2015, unfortunately, because what I'd said predominantly in this Wikipedia leak was true. They failed miserably.
And that was in the Netherlands, correct?
Withdrew. That was in Rotterdam. Yeah. Otherwise, of course, at every given opportunity, they try to besmirch my character, and that continues, of course, to this very day. The jury's still out how successful they've been, but yes, the fact it continues says something, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it brings us really to what happened in July of last year. I was preparing to write about your experience as a whistleblower and indeed your revelations. And just as we were preparing what would we hope to become a documentary or a podcast, you took a holiday with your family and found yourself arrested at the airport, which was just the latest of kind of punitive attempts to besmirch you and undermine you. What exactly happened on that day?
Just before then, I also missed out the letter I received threatening to invoke the confidentiality clause that was contained in the mutual termination agreement, threatening to seek 15,000 euros a day. That was also added to the list. Yes, 283 days ago, I arrived with my family in Dubrovnik. I was arrested under an Interpol red notice for quote, bribery, oblique corruption, which is kind of odd given that's what I've been reporting SBM to all those authorities, for the previous 5 or so years, and incarcerated for 5 days, and have had to stay here ever since. You couldn't make it up. Even the prosecutor in Monaco disagrees with the charge of bribery, oblique corruption. SBM claims to have withdrawn the complaint, but they didn't. To the press, Monaco should never have applied for the red notice, because to get one, red notice is what you're arrested, it's like an arrest warrant on the back of. But for one to be ripe, you have to be facing a trial or a sentence, normally because you've been tried in your absence. Neither apply to me. They haven't even questioned me. The red notice was in fact withdrawn. It was cancelled on the 17th of December. But that makes no difference to my plight here. The court proceedings have begun, and I'm stuck in a Kafka situation where the case is being ping-ponged between a lower and a higher court. They don't go up, they keep going back and forth here. And yeah, remarkably, I am still here.
I think that's the point at which we should bring in the other participants. So Toby and Anna, if you're listening, it would be great if you could. So welcome. I think what happened was immediately there was a great deal of international attention on your case, and people just came forward and offered their help. And 2 of those people were Toby and Anna. I wanted to turn to Toby first. You now, Jonathan, find yourself in this appalling situation where you've been arrested, you've been thrown in prison, in fact, and absolutely devastating development. Toby, it would just be helpful, I think, just to talk through how on earth it was possible for the authorities to act in this way, and your impressions initially of the case.
Thank you. Well, I think, I happened to be on holiday in Croatia when Jonathan was first arrested. I think I was about 50 miles away from him at the time, but due to COVID and being separated by a Bosnian border, it wasn't possible for me to go and meet Jonathan during that time. And I think my view at that time as to the reasons for his arrest have not improved, certainly have not changed a great deal. We were very much of the opinion that Monaco had abused the Interpol system and continues to do so. I think some of the concerns that we had initially, Jonathan had been in the United Kingdom where the Monaco authorities could have requested his extradition. They chose not to because they knew that they would fail. They could have sought his arrest when he was in France just earlier the same year. Again, they chose not to because they knew that it would be unsuccessful. It is unfortunate that they chose very carefully a country like Croatia. And it was very clear that the Monegasque authorities had been in contact with the Croatian authorities in order to nab Jonathan when he landed, when he was in a foreign country, and a country that has an approach to extradition, which is not what we would expect to see in our own countries. It's unfortunate in a system like Croatia, and I have some experience of working in the Balkans, having lived there for 9-10 years, is that the law tends to be applied to the strict letter without any diversion into assessment of facts or exceptional circumstances, which there very clearly is in Jonathan's case. We made quite clear from the outset, working alongside Jonathan's Croatian lawyer, Vedran Gennaro, who has done as an exceptional job as we could have expected in the circumstances. But we made it quite clear that the request to Interpol for the issuance of a red notice was an abusive process. The extradition proceedings based on the Interpol warrant constituted a flagrant denial of justice, and as a whistleblower, with all of the protections that should go along with that, that the courts should take that into account. And as Jonathan's explained, you have this ping-pong effect where the Dubrovnik court, which is the first instance court, effectively rubber stamps the request. We then appeal, the Supreme Court then partially upholds the appeal, but they don't make a final determination. They send it back to the first instance court for reconsideration. And we've now had that happen 3 times. And so Jonathan is fast approaching 1 year in exile. And for those that think that it is no great hardship being stuck in Croatia, let me tell you, when you are stuck in such a situation, you could be in the Bahamas. It makes no difference as to where you are when you are stuck in such a state of uncertainty, being targeted by an oppressive system, which is exactly what it is. One of the concerns that we had is we targeted the political nature of the Interpol warrant. And just days before Interpol were due to rule, and we believe rule in our favor, and suspend any data in the system and withdraw the warrant, the Monegasque authorities miraculously communicated to Interpol that they were withdrawing the warrant. They then made a number of very bizarre requests seeking to get Jonathan to effectively breach Croatian law by jumping on a plane and flying to Monaco, where they could then interview him, which of course we said that he would have to be crazy to do that. But it was very clear that they had been informed by Interpol, and it's standard practice. I'm not saying that there's anything particularly nefarious in what Interpol have done, but there is communication between Interpol HQ and then the NCB, the National Criminal Bureau in the state, where they may ask particular questions and may give an indication that the warrant is going to be withdrawn. And so, or the warrant is going to be dismissed. And so the warrant was then withdrawn by the Monegasque authorities. But then worse than that, they then misrepresented to the Croatian court. Probably misrepresented is giving them more credit than they deserve. They lied to the Croatian court as to the existence of the warrant, indicating that the warrant was still in force. And so we had to contact Interpol. Interpol, unfortunately, are very slow in responding, but they ultimately responded by saying, no, the position is unchanged. The warrant is no longer in force. We then asked them to continue to consider the warrant because of the implications that it had. And then they responded to us very recently to say that there is no warrant, no request had been made to reinstate it, and we would obviously be informed if any request was made. So to us, it clearly demonstrated what the Monegasque authorities were prepared to do. But more than that, one of the other worrying aspects is that in order to have an Interpol warrant and in order to seek the extradition of an individual, and recognizing they're two separate matters, so the fact that the Interpol warrant is withdrawn does not automatically terminate the extradition proceedings, even though it does demonstrate the political nature of and the abusive nature of the extradition request. But what was worrying was that it then became quite clear that what they wanted was to interview or interrogate Jonathan for the purpose of determining whether he should be charged. Now, that's not what Interpol and that's not what the extradition process is for. It's very clear that there are only two forms in which a person can be extradited. And that is, if they are wanted for prosecution, namely to stand trial on charges as an accused person, or if they have previously been convicted either in their presence or in their absence, and they are there to serve a sentence. And what the Monegasque authorities had confirmed, which the Croatian courts seemed to have an inability to understand, is that this request did not fit within either of those two. And there is a separate procedure through mutual legal assistance, which a foreign state can do through, we do all the time in this country through the National Crime Agency, is that a person can be questioned by the authorities in that country to determine whether there is a case against them or not. They chose not to take the mutual legal assistance route. They chose to take the more oppressive route of having Jonathan arrested, thrown in jail, and then effectively confined to the Croatian borders for the best part of 1 year in order to break him down, we believe, so that he will then effectively surrender to the authorities. And of course, that is using the system. I mean, I can get onto more with the ineffectiveness of Jonathan's own government, but effectively that's the process as we see it.
That's what I wanted to raise as well. Really, is there one might ask the question of why the British government has not done more to support a British citizen who is a whistleblower, established as a whistleblower, recognised by whistleblowing organisations around the world as such, who has contributed to bringing to justice wrongdoers around the globe. There has been an attempt to get the British government to intervene. They, on the face of it, quite rightly say that they can't intervene in a foreign jurisdiction. Could you maybe just take us through what exactly your impression is of the British government? You've got long experience of working on such cases around the world. What is the reality of this?
Well, I think if you could get a straightforward answer out of the UK government, in particular the FCDO, as to why they've done absolutely nothing, then you'll be a better lawyer than I am. We have tried to get an answer, and we have tried to get them to comply with their obligations, and they have failed to do so. And I'll take issue with one point you said and correct you that when you say on the face of it, they are not permitted to intervene. Yes, they are. In certain circumstances, they are, and these are one of those situations where they are. It's not that they are permitted; they are obligated to intervene. The other point that I would say is that you're right when you say that that's what they have relied on. That there is this long-standing rule. They frequently invoke the the UN Vienna Convention on consular access, and so they frequently cite that as a basis for legally not being permitted to intervene. Regrettably, I mean, that is a falsehood, because we have cited at least 12 separate instances where they have intervened, when they have actively intervened, and more recently, and we're not criticizing them for having intervened in the case of, for example, the plight of the very unfortunate British Iranian lady Nazanin, who's currently detained in Iran. We're not talking about the action that they've taken in relation to the Russian political opponent who has been on a hunger strike. They should intervene in cases like that. We cited a case in which I was actually on the other side, involving the government of the Maldives, when the British government actively intervened in pressuring the Maldives government to release an individual who was not a British national, mind, to actively intervene to allow him to be released to the UK to undergo medical treatment on the basis that he was then going to be granted political asylum. So you have to say, if you are not permitted to intervene, if it goes contrary to the Vienna Convention in order for you to do that, why have you breached it on at least 12 separate occasions in the past then? And that is the concern that we have. And we have been involved in other cases where they have directly intervened, where you have statements by the PM, statements by the foreign minister, statements by the ambassador, and they still fail to do anything. All they've done is they have requested the Monegasque authorities to ensure that Jonathan would not be tortured or sentenced to death if he was extradited to Monaco. Well, we've never argued that he's going to be tortured or sentenced to death. That's not the point. He's a whistleblower. He has exposed the largest scale corruption in the oil and gas industry. And even if the FCDO do not care about Jonathan, and it would appear that they do not care about Jonathan, but even if they don't, then what they've got to think about is the very chilling message that this is sending to whistleblowers around the world who are about to put their lives on the line by doing the right thing. And they're going to ask themselves the question, is it really worth the risk?
Absolutely. And that brings us perfectly to our other guest today, Anna Myers. And I think initially what would be good would be to, if it doesn't seem absurd, to talk about the positive element of what's been happening with Jonathan. Immediately that he was arrested in Dubrovnik, people came forward via social media and other networks to offer their support, including Toby himself. Could you maybe explain, Anna, the nature of this international network of support that's come forward and why it's so important in these kinds of cases?
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted to. I think, listening to Jonathan and then to Toby, you're getting a really clear sense of the structure and the operation of the global oil industry. So you've got all of that, and there's people probably who are listening to this who know about that world, and as lawyers may be actively not involved in corruption, but just understand the structures of business. And then you have Toby talking about the legal structures around extradition and this issue of cross-border corruption. We have also the involvement of 5 separate prosecuting authorities that Jonathan went to with the substance of the disclosure. And now we have at least 2 judicial systems dealing with his extradition, Monaco requesting it, Croatian courts dealing with it, and the UK not doing anything. And I think what it shows is we've had these structures that develop in which lots of parties cooperate. And in the point around a whistleblower, it gets individualized so quickly. And yet we've got to keep reminding ourselves that these issues affect us all. And whistleblowers are raising issues and showing where our accountability mechanisms, and ultimately in this case in particular, where our legal systems have not caught up, are not addressing how you take end to end. Here's the corruption, here's the disclosures, here's the whistleblower, here's the reprisals, and how do we all work to ensure that we don't de-collectivize, in a sense, the issues and then just let one person take the fall for it. So what has happened around the support group, which I think is happening more in the civil society sector, and when I say civil society, these are lawyers organizations, these are journalist protection organizations, these are anti-corruption organizations, which are full of people who've also worked in these fields and take a real sense of responsibility for making them work better. And WIN is an international network of NGOs that focus on whistleblower protection. So at its core are nonprofit organizations that give legal advice and support to whistleblowers. I think one of the amazing things is we're getting our act together. So in a sense, as power and the corruption that we're all dealing with really gets more and more exposed, and I would say COVID has revealed so much, and there's an element of Jonathan's case of him being stuck in Croatia during a global pandemic that also adds a stress and an incredible burden on him to be separated from his family during this, which I just, find hard to fathom. Even on that basis, the UK government could say something really sensible. And what we had was these groups and people coming together to say, we all believe that this case is important, that Jonathan's position is unacceptable, and it's unacceptable for these global issues and for us to fight corruption. As Toby said, the chilling effect is massive, but it's not just massive on whistleblowers who could speak up around corruption so that we can see it. It's really massive for the authorities that say they want to investigate corruption and haul it in, rein in some of these power structures, because who would go to the SFO? And this is some of the messages that have come through of the authorities that relied on Jonathan, who went to him when this issue really broke and relied on him to give them information to at least send them in the right direction for further investigations. How can they expect to continue to have that cooperation from people who have the knowledge of what's going on if they don't start to see that these other systems in play certainly have something to do with their jobs? And I think one of the things that really has struck me in this work with Jonathan and working with the group is how marvelous it's been to have all the brain power. And obviously, there's perspectives on this that involve what the public needs to know about the case, why the journalist protection organizations like the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom and the Media Freedom Rapid Response Fund that's helping support Jonathan to just survive in Zagreb during this period, because you must remember that when whistleblowers are put into these absolutely closed positions, they no longer are able to work. So they're losing their livelihoods and their professional sense of credibility and sense of self. And their families are put under incredible strain. And he's been separated from his family for this amount of time. So these groups all understand both the personal costs, but what that means, I think, longer term for these systems that we claim are working to prevent, not only prevent, but detect and prosecute corruption, they won't work if we let someone like Jonathan hang out to dry. And we have had partly, I think, what Jonathan has perhaps sort of caught the wind in the sails of is that there was a really coming together of these groups around the adoption of the EU directive on the protection of whistleblowers. And every time I'm involved with one of these issues or one of these great events, they almost become obsolete as the ink dries on them. There's so much that the EU directive on the protection of reporting persons puts enshrines in law from the knowledge that we've had of what works, but what it hasn't still kind of cracked the nut on. And this is really where European powers, and this is where Jonathan is sitting in Europe writ large, really need to get their act together on is, yes, we might get our national systems in order, and that would certainly help. But how does it deal with these cross-border cases? How do we ensure that the UK will talk about, support, be very clear in their own heads of why they need to be speaking up in the interests of whistleblowers, a UK citizen abroad, why Croatia, who's also has a whistleblowing law, needs to see this as something that their courts need to think about slightly differently? Because I think one point I would make before I sort of finish off here is that in the early days of whistleblower protection, we were looking at labor rights, which were often seen as individual issues. And one of the key, I think, dances we've had to do, and really we've worked hard on the using the law properly to make it understood that there may be individual ramifications, but what the issues are that are being raised are public interest issues. And so some of the strains and stresses you see being really pointed out quite clearly by Toby is you can't suddenly then just say, well, that's about another legal system where we don't intervene, or the system just does a kind of straight letter rule of letter of the law interpretation without seeing what's behind the reasons for the arrest and the fact that that actually is a reprisal against them. They're using an abusive system, an abuse of power and an abuse of a legal system to try and get at him for the very things that he was reporting them on. And you have to then get behind that very quickly, or else you're just going to keep all the power in the hands of the authorities, and you're not balancing it out so Jonathan has a fighting chance to survive.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to go back to Jonathan now. We are starting to get quite a lot of questions in, and in fact, one of them is the question I was going to ask Jonathan myself to summarize the situation, which is, you blew the whistle because you thought it was the right thing to do. As a result, there have been an extraordinary number of investigations and people brought to book, which is hugely positive. But you find yourself in this situation now in Croatia. You've been there for a very long time. Do you think it was worth it? Or indeed, what would you say to other whistleblowers? And be as honest as you can here.
So given what the alternatives were at the time, it had to be done. It can't really be talked about in terms of whether it was worth it. I had no choice to have carried on in the direction I was heading towards. Had I stayed, I would have been a party to the very cover-up of most of these bribes. I would have been reporting to external counsel. I was one of the leaders of this committee that was set up originally to investigate the fraud. So I would have spent the rest of my life, first of all, my conscience wouldn't have allowed that to happen. But just that aside, I would have been spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder because I would have been an associate to the crime in trying to cover it up. So would have always been worth it, yes, because of the alternative that I faced at the very time. And notwithstanding. Also, a lot has come of it, particularly in Brazil. I was very proud to be the one that probably pushed the first domino that led to the permanent political landscape permanent change to the political landscape in Brazil, and the impeachments of Dilma Rousseff and imprisonment of her predecessor. So it's not as if there haven't been consequences to my actions, which of course I'm very proud of. I'm not proud to be here for 283 days, no, but I'd have been naive not to expected consequences for doing obviously the right thing. Hopefully in the future, and this is touching what Anna and Toby have said, the world needs to grow up and learn that it's not ready for people like me because of the way I've been treated. And hopefully, who knows, legislation may be introduced that does give robust protection to whistleblowers, because everyone that sees me will realize, well, I'm going nowhere. Look what happened to Taylor. And maybe it was the sacrifice that was necessary. Then it would be for a good purpose if something comes of this.
I mean, the specific question is, given what's happened, would you do anything differently if you could do it again, Jonathan?
Well, I started with, I was trying to be anonymous. I was anonymous with the SEC. I was anonymous with the, obviously with my Wikipedia leak, but it's not difficult to work out who I was at the time. 2 significant resignations from the legal department. People got wind of what was going on, so it had been impossible really to remain anonymous. So, I couldn't have really done much about that either. I remained anonymous. It would have been nigh impossible. So I can't even say, oh, I wish I'd remained anonymous, because even that wouldn't have been practical. Yes, I would have definitely, had I known what the future held, would have sought protection or sought assistance from those prosecutors that I provided a wealth of information from, which they profited so hugely from. I would have sought some sorts of assurances from them that they would cover my back, and they would seek to do whatever was necessary through their government to protect me in the event that a vengeful principality, that is Monaco, went after me. That's probably what I would have tried to do.
And there's a question here about, which is an obvious question really, which is, what has the SFO done? How has the SFO commented on the situation?
Serious farce office. It just likes to take information from me and do absolutely nothing to date. It even takes credit for monies it has received, thanks to me, obviously without mentioning a word of my name. It just enjoys taking information and not lifting a finger in helping me in any way whatsoever. It's a disgrace.
I mean, it might be worth bringing in Anna at this point to ask your opinion as to, what the SFO should be doing really in this case to encourage other whistleblowers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are former and active police officers and people who have themselves dealt with sources who are very critical of the SFO for the very same reason. And the SFO isn't the only prosecuting authority that doesn't make this link. If you voluntarily come forward and give information and work with them, it's almost as if you're on your own. And if there's this thing that seems, I think the thing that I would like to stress is what's so positive, Jonathan, for us and for me in the field looking at this is how many people are working and want to support you, even though the link really for the original disclosures and all the absolutely positive consequences as a result, where they were able to hold SBM to account, happened quite a number of years ago. And people see what we need to understand is the reprisal can continue long after, and the chilling effect that they're trying to achieve can still happen. And it is important now that people are seeing you as an important person to support, even though perhaps what they're not seeing is you actively now part of an international corruption scandal. And that, most of the time where it has worked, it's about someone who's right now part of what everyone else is talking about. I think what we're really seeing is people think this is absolutely unacceptable because corruption is something that everyone now sees as very much a global problem, almost in a hyper way, that we need to get to grips with. And you really represent somebody who did the right thing and should not be facing this at all. So that for me is really positive. And the fact that the brains around you are looking at it from the legal side, from the journalistic side, from the public awareness side is really important, because it takes a collective response even to an individual situation for this to really change. And so it's important that that people in the room listening to this see this as a very active live case that matters.
Yes. There's a question here for Toby. Please could you explain further precisely what the legal basis is for the Croatian courts pursuing the case against Jonathan, despite the withdrawal of the warrant against him? Is this something peculiar to Croatia or something that applies to numerous jurisdictions?
So first of all, I think the point I made earlier is that the Interpol warrant and the extradition request are two separate independent processes. So it was the Interpol warrant that Jonathan was originally arrested on, and he could have only been held for a period of time until an extradition request is made. Once the extradition request is made, in many respects, it doesn't matter whether the Interpol warrant is in force or not, it doesn't affect the legality of the extradition request. The point is the reasons given for the issuance of the Interpol warrant and the challenges that we made. If Interpol had refused, rejected, overturned that warrant, it would have had a significant impact on the extradition request, which was, in our view, the reason why they withdrew it at the 11th hour. And as I said, it was literally a couple of days before Interpol was due to make a decision on our challenge to the warrant. So the legal basis for making the request was the extradition request from Monaco. The concern that we have raised is that, first of all, the allegations that were set out in the original warrant do not correspond with what was subsequently on the extradition request. So there is a concern. That was the first concern that we had. Then the second concern that we had was that obviously the warrant had been withdrawn and was no longer in force. And then thirdly, it was very clear from a document that the Monegasque authorities had submitted to the Croatian authorities that Jonathan was not wanted to stand trial. They wanted to interrogate him and then make a determination of whether he should be prosecuted. And we say that does not provide a lawful basis. And that seems to have been sidestepped by the Croatian court, where we are hopeful that the Supreme Court will recognize this. In the last set of appeal proceedings, the Supreme Court raised this by returning it to the First Instance Court in Dubrovnik to answer the question as to what was the basis. But again, the response that the Monegasque authorities gave was simply just not credible. We've had to take that back to the Supreme Court again for, I think, the third or possibly the fourth time, for them to rule again. We are hopeful that they will see the errors of their ways and just bring this farce to an end, because it doesn't appear that the Dubrovnik court, the First Instance Court, is going to do anything than just rubber stamp the extradition request. And it's now for the Supreme Court to decide that. If they don't, then we have to take it to the Constitutional Court and then ultimately to the European Court of Human Rights, where we are confident that we would be successful. The problem for Jonathan is that he has to sit in limbo whilst all of this goes on.
So I think there has been a small development today on that front, hasn't there? Jonathan, I don't know whether you wanted to mention that.
So the latest decision of the Supreme Court was made on the 20th of April, so that was 17 days ago. I've been told now that the judgment is in the post, I joke not, on its way by the end of business today to Dubrovnik, where it will turn up and my lawyer, my local lawyer in Dubrovnik, will be told of the outcome. I dared go to the court in person today for a copy. I live 200 yards away from the court, but no, that would be illegal with the words, God forbid. So I should know the outcome during the course of next week.
Okay, thank you. Now there's a separate question involving the Brad Birkenfeld case, and the question is: does the Brad Birkenfeld outcome suggest that all whistleblowers will only go to the US authorities moving forwards? This is one for Anna, I believe.
Yeah, well, Jonathan and I can both answer that. I mean, Brad Birkenfeld did go to jail, so it wasn't a straightforward trip for him, because he was found to have been involved in some of the wrongdoing. Yes, he got, I think at that time, and it may have been surpassed by now, one of the largest rewards from the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which Jonathan mentioned didn't even pick up on the issues when he raised them. So let us put this in context that the vast majority of those who go to the SEC never get a reward. It has to be new information they haven't got, and it has to be information that they can see is directly linked to a prosecution and the recovery of information, of fines. So, and yes, when it does come through, it can be quite eye-watering in terms of the numbers. Certainly other authorities in the US, and there are some that also have rewards, but I do believe, and then perhaps this is where Jonathan can jump in. I mean, the US authorities tend to give themselves authority to go after bad guys in ways that perhaps we don't see our SFO doing this in the same way, and calling individuals certainly to account. And I do believe you worked with some of the authorities and some of the individuals in the prosecution who were prosecuted in the U.S. For on the SBM offshore case.
Yes, so it's true to say the most recent former CEO was jailed for 3 years, and one of the leading salesmen relating to Brazil was incarcerated for 18 months. So yes, the DOJ did act on the information that I ultimately provided it with by way of this settlement or deferred prosecution agreement, to be precise, and the pursuit of 2 individuals to date. The point being, of course, it's made absolutely no difference whatsoever to my fate, whether I've been paid a dime or nothing, or $200 million from the SEC. Of course, I wasn't. The fact that I assisted the FBI in any way I could over multiple meetings in person and on the telephone has made no difference whatsoever to my fate and the fact that I'm here. No assistance, no help. Where are they now?
Yes, I don't think the answer is a straightforward yes, but I think that in terms of if people think that it'll make a difference, they might explore US options where there are US links on international corruption, for sure.
And I mean, just to clarify, these incentives do not exist within a British context. I mean, there are some people lobbying the British government to bring in whistleblower incentives. I suggest that's a whole other topic for discussion that we might have another day. But it is an interesting proposition. It doesn't really fit within British culture, this idea of having incentives to whistleblowers. But it certainly is seen to be effective in the United States. So it's something that probably should be discussed.
Yeah, I just would add it's limited still. So it looks big when it happens, but still a very few number of those and that go to the SEC or any of the authorities that which there will be monetary rewards at the end. But it's at the end and it requires a lot to go through. The False Claims Act does give more agency to the individual whistleblower, and it is a model that we tend to think of not put into the same pot. But I do think the real issue and what should be remembered is whistleblowers want to make a difference, and then they also want to survive the process. Jonathan, there are whistleblowers for whom neither happens. It doesn't make any difference and they still don't survive. There are whistleblowers for whom it doesn't make a difference and they survive well, but they're happy they did it. And Jonathan is in this incredibly crazy situation in which it is very clear to all of us that he made a difference, that it was important that he spoke up, and there is absolutely no reason that he should be left hanging, and that somehow these systems where things were triggered in 2014 are still following him in 2021. And I repeat, during a global pandemic, when he is not a risk of fleeing person. He has a family in England who awaits him, and he said again and again how open he is to talking to the Monegasque authorities through Zoom, as we are doing now, and answering all their questions. And he'd be happy to do that in Britain at the Monaco embassy or whatever would work.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our time. The final question was about what advice you'd give to future whistleblowers. I think some of that has been covered in the answers we had already. Maybe I just want to return briefly to Toby and then briefly to Jonathan at the end. Just really, Toby, you're very experienced, but I just wondered what you've drawn from this case, what you've learned from this case. and perhaps in answer to that final question, you know, what have you learned that you can pass on to people who may be in the same position?
Well, I don't think I'm necessarily hugely experienced, but I've certainly learned a lot in the last 9 months. And I mean, certainly learned a lot through having conversations with the incredible group that we have and speaking to Jonathan about what this has done to him, what this has done to his family. And so I think that anyone who is preparing to go through something, even approaching what Jonathan has gone through, I think they need to ensure that they have a support group around them before they take any action. I think that their families are fully aware of what they're doing and why it's important. But I think having, this is not an offer, but to have a lawyer ready to assist them, to have people, incredible people like Anna and all of the other people that we have on Jonathan's support team, to have them ready to jump into action, because I think that's what is required. I think a lot of people go into this thinking that this is you know, they're going to come out of this smelling of roses, and it's just not going to happen. I think you have to be prepared that it is a huge sacrifice that you have to make on your personal liberty, your personal security, and the fact that it's not going to go away. But I think apart from that, groups need to do more in pressuring governments and pressuring international organizations to do more to protect people like Jonathan, in order to make this much less of a painful experience. So I think it's much more not what should a potential whistleblower do and be prepared for, but what can we do to make it so much more bearable for them to do, considering they're putting their entire lives and their families' lives at risk, and their personal security and their economic stability. And you've got to think of all of these things before you go through this.
Okay, so final word to Jonathan. We are over time, but I'd like to give you the final word, Jonathan, before wrapping up.
All right, so the story obviously is not over. I suppose the effect of my whistleblowing is realised and witnessed by the fact that they, whoever they are still very much after me. There is a part of me that is very proud of what I've done, but I do hope that lessons will be learned as a result of my experience. That's probably the single most important thing for me in the future. But most of all, and this repeats, echoes what Toby just said, my support group, of which the 3 other panelists are very much an integral part of, has made all the difference to me and my well-being, which is why I can come across, at least, as relatively sane after getting on for 10 months now, stranded here in Croatia. That as single matter has made all the difference in the world, and I will forever be so thankful for each and every member of that group for their caring, their supports that they've shown me for so long and continue to.
Thank you very much. Well, look, it just remains for me to say thank you to thought leaders for hosting this event. Obviously, to thank our panelists Toby Kaplan and Anna Myers. Above all, to thank Jonathan for his time and his patience, and wish him all the luck for the future. And thank you very much.